If you've been following this channel for any length of time, you know that I was raised as a Christian fundamentalist, specifically independent fundamental Baptist. I was a very fervent believer, but I came to question my faith and then eventually leave it at the age of 21. Now, when I saw Midnight Mass on Netflix, it did not feel like a work of fiction. Experiencing nearly every scene felt like reliving a moment from my past or seeing how my life could have turned out if I had stayed in the faith. Once I finished the series, I had to discuss it with someone who I knew could say the same thing, my friend and fellow content creator, V.
I'm Bianca, and I was also raised in Christian fundamentalism. My father was a non-denominational evangelical pastor to a home church that bordered on a cult. After leaving home and studying the origins of Christianity for several years, I also left my faith. I actually hesitated watching Midnight Mass because I knew it would evoke so many strong and painful memories, and I wasn't wrong, but I am so happy that Drew asked me to help with this video because I think the real message of this show is both important and timely.
It's that shared experience that drove V and I to collaborate on this video to show how we think Midnight Mass portrays Christian radicalization just right. We won't be examining the truth value of any religious belief here, as we've each done in some of our other work. Instead, we'll discuss the utility of religion as a psychological and social tool. In an interview, writer and director Mike Flanagan gave this view of religion.
All of our religions draw on two things: our desire for there to be life after we die, and our rampant fear of everything else in the world, even down to the weather. We create gods to explain earthquakes and volcanoes. When we're afraid, we deify it.
It's from this perspective that religion is depicted in Midnight Mass, and it's the one we'll utilize throughout this video. We will examine one character at a time, discussing how they use their faith to deal with those fears and desires, as well as how that relates to radicalization.
Major spoiler warning, by the way, every section of this video after this will include serious spoilers for Midnight Mass. So if you haven't seen it, this is your chance to save this video for later and go watch the series first. An ideal setting for radicalization, Crockett Island. All but a handful of scenes in Midnight Mass take place on Crockett Island, a fishing community with a population of 127. As we hear throughout the show, the nearest town over on the mainland is 30 miles away. This place is insulated from outside information and influence. Just as crucial as its remoteness is its state of decay. Crockett used to be a vibrant community with a strong sense of identity and plenty of resources to sustain its economy. When a nearby oil spill severely damaged the surrounding ecosystem a few years ago, though, that changed. Many people left, and those who stayed saw their livelihoods nearly destroyed. As Annie Flynn says in episode 1, this isn't a community anymore. It's a ghost. Those on the outside of extremist movements and ideologies can struggle to understand their appeal, but when we recognize that extremism offers many an illusion of privileged status and control, we can not only empathize, but identify those vulnerable to radicalization. The people on Crockett live in quiet despair, having profoundly little control of their fates. This is what vulnerability to radicalization looks like in the real world: isolation, loss of identity, and little control over one's future. Riley, the lost soul. We meet Riley in a moment instrumental to his loss of faith, one where, as he later describes, he lived a moment inconsistent with a loving God. Atheist characters in film are often written with tragic backstories. They're faithful believers until some sudden loss, at which point they immediately curse God, renounce their faith, and become depressive nihilists or arrogant blowhards. While maintaining some elements of this narrative, Riley is far from a caricature intended to disparage non-believers. In his first scene, Riley loses all connection to any ideology capable of making sense of his tragic experience. His Christian understanding of life, death, and divine justice falls completely flat in the face of the randomness just as much as the violence of his accident. Quite literally haunted by his resulting guilt, Riley spends his years in prison looking for anything that will give meaning to his experience. He studies religion after religion, but finds none of them convincing. As he says in episode 1, he went in looking for God, but came out an atheist. Consequently, Riley does not use religion to fill in the gaps in his knowledge. When he doesn't understand something, he investigates, following the empirical evidence wherever it leads. Sometimes his resulting knowledge provides similar utility to that which religion offers other characters. In his first Alcoholics Anonymous meeting with Monsignor Pruitt, for example, Riley explains a secular alternative to the religious methodology of AA, rational recovery. To quote Riley in that scene from episode 2, rational recovery, it's based more on reason and psychology. It's about empowering people instead of saying they're powerless. Addictive voice recognition technique, that's how it works. AVRT. Recognizing the addictive voice inside. It's not that I want to drink, it's that the addictive voice wants to, the AV. So you learn to identify it, separate it, and control it. Coupled with his tendency to investigate is an acute awareness that the comfort some narratives can provide don't make such narratives true, and in fact, that comforting narratives can be used as tools of manipulation. This understanding doesn't always serve Riley well. It isolates him from his family, who believe participation in church and acting according to God's supposed will to be vital for moral living. It is this feature of Riley's critical thinking, however, that eventually allows him to make what is quite possibly the most difficult moral choice of the series. In his final scene with Monsignor Pruitt, Riley listens to Pruitt explain how his new spiritual insight allows him to do things which he'd previously considered monstrous. Pruitt no longer feels any guilt over killing Joe Colley. Riley says that disgusts him, but when Pruitt demands Riley's total honesty, Riley admits his envy of the lack of conscience that Pruitt's extremism provides. His guilt over his accident has never faded. As much as he longs for relief from that guilt, Riley still doesn't go Pruitt's way. Pruitt isn't in touch with God. He's not hearing God's voice clearer every day, Riley recognizes. Pruitt is an addict being gradually consumed by the addictive voice in his head, with no tools to recognize it for what it really is. Pruitt's narrative could finally offer Riley the comfort he's been lacking for years, but seeing the harm that accepting it would cause others, Riley decides that even his own death is preferable. This is a choice which I believe most viewers would consider to be not only right, but noble. Ironically, as the only atheist in the series, Riley's final acts are quite literally the most Christ-like of any characters, except it isn't divinity which drives his self-sacrifice. It's his hard-earned understanding of the guilty mistakes he cannot change, the courage to scrutinize and change the things he can, and the critical thought to know the difference. A final note on Riley. When he explains his view of death to Erin, he does so in purely naturalistic terms. Religion obviously does not mitigate any anxiety surrounding death for him, but it doesn't seem like he needs it to. He clearly finds wonder and beauty in the cycle of life and death without religion. Riley does not search for eternal life like Pruitt. He doesn't try to cheat or hide from death like Bev. He instead decidedly finds beauty in and becomes content with the inevitable. While this is probably a more difficult way to cope with mortality for most, its utility cannot be denied. Riley's contentment with mortality guards him from being manipulated by the feel-good narratives of men like Pruitt, and ultimately enables him to face his own death for the good of others. Monsignor Pruitt, the faithful, charismatic leader. We're introduced to this character not as Monsignor Pruitt, but as Father Paul, a compassionate new face in Crockett, ready to serve a community in desperate need. His first sermon is on revival, which is what he intends to bring to Crockett. He's seen the hardship everyone on the island has endured. He himself grew increasingly frail as the island sunk into desolation. He's been given a second chance now, though, and if his revitalized faith can be spread, he thinks, so will Crockett. As Pruitt says in his sermon in episode 2, that's what it means to have faith, that in the darkness, in the worst of it, in the absence of light and hope, we sing. Restore us again, we sing to the sky, and he will, my friends, he will. That same hand that dealt you your hardship, that same hand will make you whole. Pruitt sees everything through the lens of faith. Prosperity is a blessing from God. Hardship is God's will. Life is God's gift to us, and death is a part of his plan. After years of physical and mental decline, a figurative wandering in the desert, Pruitt finds himself wandering in the literal desert of Israel. Something hiding in the ruins of an ancient church captures and then feeds on him. This terrifies Pruitt, but like everything else that has ever happened to him, it must be God's will. His fall into mental illness? Necessary to carry out God's plan. Being violently fed upon by a winged monster? Communion with an angel. Being transformed into his younger self and requiring the blood of an angel to survive? A miraculous second chance at life. Faith not only explains all unknowns for Pruitt, but also justifies moral decisions that most would find objectionable. He doesn't need the consent of his congregation to spread the angel's virus to them because it must be God's will for him to do so. Sure, he feels some initial guilt for deceiving them, but a brief confessional allows him to push guilt aside and continue without hesitation. As Pruitt consumes more of the angel's blood, this behavior only continues. Soon, enough of the virus is included in the sacrament to begin healing the people of Crockett, and religious fervor begins to stir. Mike Flanagan's use of a virus as a metaphor for religious radicalization is excellent and accurately represents what I've seen in my personal life as a former fundamentalist. It starts out innocuous enough. A dizzy spell of new and novel beliefs, a cough of groupish rhetoric, a fever of newfound passion. Without near immediate intervention, though, it grows into something dangerous, something which consumes its hosts and replaces all they used to be with itself. Then it spreads to others. When Pruitt finally dies of the angel's virus and is reborn as something new, it's no wonder that shortly thereafter he's able to murder Joe Colley, then rationalize his actions as involuntary or even necessary. Faith narratives are inherently unfalsifiable and therefore malleable enough to rationalize nearly anything. At this point, Pruitt's faith becomes a bludgeon to anything in conflict with it, whether guilt or reason. Listen to what he says in his sermon in episode 5. It is a war, and there will be casualties, and we must be soldiers. That is what Good Friday is about. God will ask horrible things of you. Horrible. Just look at what he asked of his own son. Just look at what Jesus had to endure. What is otherwise horrible is good because of where it's headed. Welcome to God's army. He who was once a gentle, compassionate servant of Crockett Island has transformed into a militant radical determined to commit what he acknowledges to be atrocities. He could still reverse course, removing himself from Crockett and letting things return to relative normalcy. But as many newly radicalized people do before carrying out acts of extremism, Pruitt feels he's invested too much to let go. He may have communed with monsters so many times that he's taken on their form, becoming unrecognizable to those he loves most, but quitting now would mean defeat, crushing shame, guilt, and suffering beyond anything he experienced before he set out on this course. So, naturally, he decides to see his plan through. Once Pruitt awakens to see the chaos of his plan coming to fruition, he finally sees that he has been horribly wrong and admits that his motivation all along has been to recapture the life that priesthood never allowed him, one spent with his lover Mildred Gunning and his daughter Sarah. Even with great faith, he has been unable to cope with the inevitability and finality of death. His faith's solution to the fear of death proved unsatisfactory, so he used his faith to create a solution of his own, only to see that fail as well. Pruitt's intentions have always been good. He wanted to provide an ideal life for those he loves and to be a good shepherd for those lost sheep he cared for dearly. Instead, though, unable to cope with death, motivated by desperation and blinded by unceasing faith, he led Crockett to destruction. To quote his sober realization spoken to Bev in his last hours, "We are the wolves." The angel, a contamination of faith. This monster serves as a surprisingly effective metaphor for extremist ideologies. It attacks Pruitt at his most vulnerable moment. While it causes him great pain at first, it also gives Pruitt new life, a new sense of purpose, which is, of course, entirely contingent on Pruitt's continued communion with it. Any outsider looking into the situation would see a vile monster attacking a vulnerable person in order to feed. But just as it goes in real-life cases of radicalization, Pruitt, fueled by desperation, sees the attack as a revelation and his attacker as his savior. Spreading the angel's virus does accomplish what Pruitt had hoped, at least for a little while. Extremist ideologies do often give individuals a sense of hope and purpose, while giving communities a shared reality and motivation toward common goals. This can quickly create dependence on the ideology, which, like any addiction, eventually becomes destructive. In its initial stage, extremism, like the angel, hides its true form, disguising itself as something innocuous. As its victims become more dependent on it, though, it no longer needs to conceal what it really is. It's shocking to see the angel present itself to the congregation at Easter Mass And some viewers likely found themselves unable to suspend disbelief at that point. I would immediately get out of there. Anyone who's not insane would think that thing was a monster and just run. I regret to say, though, that I think their congregation's reaction to the angel, including their eventual acceptance of it as good and divine, is painfully realistic. Pruitt is a trusted authority in their community, and he says it's an angel from God. One could reject this notion, but it would mean completely changing one's mind about Pruitt. So which is it, one must decide? Is Pruitt badly mistaken, crazy, or even malicious? Or is he the godly man you've always believed him to be, who is simply delivering a hard truth? The latter is a far less emotionally taxing option for many in the congregation, and the powerful tool of cognitive dissonance is fully capable of keeping an instinctive fear and distrust of the monster at bay. In reality, the angel was a parasite. It didn't care about Crockett, it just played a part so it could feed. Extremism almost always poses as an ideology which offers miraculous benefits to its proponents, but it never delivers those benefits any longer than it needs to in order for its leaders to seize a source of power or for the ideology itself to reproduce. When the world inevitably begins to burn around it, it offers nothing. We don't know if the angel managed to find shelter before the sun came up in the series finale. Likewise, we can never be sure that extremism has been defeated even when it's lost its hosts. Wherever there is fear, desperation, vulnerability, or blind faith, extremism can rise again.
Bev Keen, the dogmatic authoritarian. Bev Keane is introduced as the responsible, if brusque, caretaker of Crockett. She has been the unofficial spiritual leader ever since Monsignor Pruitt began succumbing to dementia. But as we move deeper into the story, we find that the sense of power imbued by her religious faith has twisted her. She has truly brought her own propaganda. Throughout the series, we see her take matters of punishment into her own hands. In episode 2, she kills the dog of the town drunk, Joe Colley. This was chilling for multiple reasons. It's a gruesome and blatantly unfair death that no one seems to be shaken by, except for Joe. It also seems that everyone knows Bev is the culprit, but they willingly turn a blind eye, either because they're afraid to confront her, or because they've already accepted her as the community's moral arbiter. That kind of silence in the face of obvious harm from leadership is all too familiar in extremist circles. This theme of Bev using her influence to push her faith onto others continues, and ultimately is the catalyst for the destruction of Crockett and just about everyone who lives there. It is first directly showcased in episode 3, where Hassan, the Muslim sheriff and newcomer in town, gently confronts her for handing out Bibles at the public school. The ensuing argument, where Bev condescendingly gish-gallops all over her interlocutor with familiar fallacies and cherry-picked platitudes, is enough to send any formerly religious individual into just a ball of cringe. The tactic used here by Mike Flanagan is clear. Start with a common enough debate among the faithful, whether to teach a religious text in a public classroom, and examine the motivations and social engineering happening in that room. Bev is not just expressing a point that is familiar to Christians. She is also using her faith as a shield against the unknown, something she finds offensive and probably even frightening. She is relying on dog whistles understood by her faithful community to support this shield, and it works. What would that look like if taken to the extreme? What would happen if a person was given moral immunity in a town already on the brink of desperation in the way that Bev was? What if that person had the ability to weasel their way out of any ethical conundrum by word-vomiting holy verses and drawing loose associations to justify their actions? What if the community let them? Even though it was clear to outsiders this person was using that community and the community's faith for personal gain, to escape the fear of the unknown rather than corral it. Bev ends up destroying Crockett. She doesn't listen to Pruitt's request to de-escalate and contain the villagers once they've been quote-unquote reborn. She enacts what she considers to be divine judgment on those she doesn't think are pious enough, and she ultimately ends up burning down the whole island and dooming the townsfolk and herself to a fiery end. As a former believer with lots of experience with this kind of person, Bev's character was chilling and by far a more terrifying villain than the angel. Indeed, the angel wouldn't have been nearly as successful had it not been for her willingness to use her faith as a way to justify her own ambitions and manipulate others who trusted her. Sheriff Hassan, the rational religious other. If Pruitt and Riley are two sides of the same coin, so are Bev and Sheriff Hassan, the Muslim police officer who requested the assignment to Crockett after his wife's death. Bev is the definition of devout, but allows her faith to blind her and others to the harm that she is doing. Hassan is also a devout person, but is able to view his faith in the context of a larger story. Not only is he able to maintain both his religiosity and his rationality, he also understands that faith is a private matter, not something to be used to manipulate others. When strange things begin happening in Crockett, Hassan does not immediately buy into the narrative that Pruitt and Bev are spinning. As someone who believes that rationality is integral to practicing his faith, he resists the propaganda of extremism. This happens both literally, in the scene debating Bev about Bibles in schools, and in the context of the overall narrative. He's one of the only people who doesn't succumb to the angel's virus. And yet, he is still someone of faith. He is shown praying multiple times throughout the series, openly discussing God and the Quran, and engaging in hard theological and philosophical questions about divine intervention, the problem of evil, and how God is not magic. What Hassan is doing here is providing a counterpoint to Mike Flanagan's theory that faith is most often used to escape the fear of the unknown. Hassan is not using his faith in that way. In fact, his understanding of God prohibits that interpretation. This makes his faith less appealing to his son, not as exciting or magical as Crockett's version of God, but it also makes him immune to the faith-based extremism rampant on the island. At the end of the show, he is shown dying peacefully in the middle of prayer. Contrast this with how Bev dies, screaming and clawing at the sand, literally digging her own grave. It is the inclusion of this character that provides Midnight Mass with the nuance a lot of critiques of religion lack. It's not about whether you hold to a particular religion. The danger comes from allowing blind faith to lead you into harmful situations in an attempt to escape psychological discomfort. We see this with Pruitt, who uses his blind faith to escape guilt. We see this with Bev, who uses blind faith to maintain control. Hassan maintains his personal integrity, becomes one of the heroes of the series, and dies peacefully, having avoided this pitfall while maintaining his religion.
Now, before discussing our last major character, Erin, let's take a quick look at a few minor characters. Wade and Dolly Scarborough are two people of Crockett who became radicalized most quickly and thoroughly. Their daughter Lisa's sudden paralysis took a huge emotional as well as financial toll on the family. Lacking any other resources, they turned to the church for comfort and hope, becoming some of its most active members. When Lisa is healed, they refuse to investigate it scientifically, saying it feels wrong to investigate a miracle. The narrative of their devout faith leading to Lisa's healing is preferable to any other, so they cling to it. When Wade and Dolly witness Pruitt's death and resurrection, they again refrain from investigating before accepting it as miraculous. If God could work a miracle for them, he could certainly do so for Pruitt as well, they think. Finally, when Pruitt and Bev devise their morbid plan for Easter Mass, Wade and Dolly find themselves in a bit of a predicament. The plan could lead to catastrophe, and the so-called angel is horrifying. But do they dare investigate? If they look critically at this supposed miracle, shouldn't they do the same for Lisa's healing? What if what they find subverts their faith? This couple's vulnerability primed them to accept any narrative which could offer them comfort, so their subsequent radicalization is no surprise. Meanwhile, Ed and Annie Flynn, like all others on the island, have fallen on hard times. Ed's ability to work is deteriorating, and the returns on his work are declining. The church has always been important to them as highly principled, moral people. They're very surprised, but happy to accept Pruitt's work as miraculous for a long time. However, they refuse to drink the poison at Easter Mass, and when they're eventually killed and come back with a thirst for blood, They refuse to give in to that thirst. Instead of giving in, they sing together until the sun comes up. When radicalization begins to overtake a community, moderates within that community sometimes don't catch on until it's too late. It's easy to excuse outlandish ideas and behaviors within your own group, so when that turns to extremism, it can catch you by surprise. Consequently, some moderates become unfortunate casualties of the extremism and those around them. Now, Ali, Sheriff Hassan's son, was also uniquely vulnerable. He'd lost his mother, and thanks to the move to Crockett, his childhood home, and any relationships from the mainland. His new friends on the island are all he feels he has, and conforming to their religious beliefs and practices, which many in the community praise him for, makes him feel like he finally belongs. When it comes time to drink the poison which Pruitt and Bev offer him, he readily does so, likely feeling he has nothing to lose. If he refused, after all, he'd probably be an outsider again. Many people, like Ali, radicalize for the sake of social acceptance, as isolation can be even more terrifying than extremism.
If Ali is the outsider who converted to belong, Warren Flynn and Lisa Scarborough are the insiders, the kids who were raised in a radicalized system. These two kids have been the focal point throughout the series, and for good reason. They represent two sides of the experience of childhood indoctrination and radicalization. They are also the only characters who get off the island alive. Warren seems to be at home on Crockett. He's an altar boy, one of only a couple of boys his age, but definitely the ringleader. He's a decent person who truly doesn't know what's happening for most of the story. He represents the kid who thrived in the community, who escaped from it hurt but not broken. In an age where millennials are leaving the church in droves, Warren probably represents most of them. Lisa is the opposite. Her experience was deeply impacted by the Crockett community, both physically and emotionally. I think Drew and I both identify deeply with her for that reason. From losing her legs, to diving headlong into her faith, to being the first and most astounding miracle performed by the angel's blood, her journey is defined by this community. And it's fitting that the last line in the series is hers. As the miracle's effects fade, she says, "I can't feel my legs." Yet there's peace there. She was broken, but the acknowledgement of that brokenness from a place of safety is the first step to real healing. Dr. Sarah Gunning occupies a unique place on the island. Though she is a skeptic, she's not a firebrand like Riley or a prodigal child like Erin. She's also the only queer character. She has lots of contact with the mainland, as evidenced by her date in episode 2, and plans on leaving as soon as her mother passes. She's also the town physician and operates from a place of quiet skepticism. She's left alone because she leaves others alone. Sarah feels familiar as someone who left a community like Crockett's. She's the odd person out, but has learned how to exist in that liminal space without ruffling feathers or getting expelled, because she views her place in the community as a responsibility to be born. Keenly aware of what's wrong, she stays because she knows that others need her. And when she finally does speak out, you can tell she's been waiting for a long time.
Erin, the Seeker. We left Erin Green for last because her character sums up the point of the show most impactfully. In the same way the show ended on her deconversion moment, we will also end this review. Erin is both an archetype and a stand-in for most of Midnight Mass's audience. She is the prodigal daughter, more so than Riley even, as she has come back to achieve a semblance of belonging once again. She is both Jezebel and the Virgin Mary, pregnant and single after a series of bad decisions, and yet still portrayed as a moral and kind person. She is also the martyr, sacrificing herself in the last episode to, hopefully, mortally injure the angel and prevent it from doing further harm. Even bearing the weight of all these archetypes, she is still the most accessible person on the island, taking on the mantle of main character in the second half of the series. She is not an atheist like Riley, but she is not dogmatic like Bev. She is not as familiar with wrestling the hard theological questions as Hassan, but she is much more willing to dive into them and feel that cognitive dissonance than Pruitt is. She's not as inherently skeptical as Sarah, the doctor. but she is much more susceptible to skeptical arguments than Lisa's parents, the mayor and his wife. This makes her the perfect entry point for the audience, who probably occupy a similarly liminal space. She's the seeker, like we all are while watching this show. We're all looking for answers, keenly aware that we'll probably dislike what we find, but continuing anyway. We react as Erin reacts. Early in the series, Erin attends church and clearly finds comfort, if not something more, in Pruitt's sermons on singing songs of faith in hardship and God's promise of restoration. She wants to see this difficult time through with joy. She wants to see Crockett restored. Likewise, faith in a blissful afterlife comforts her after she loses her baby. Still, though, she supports those who find utility in narratives different from her own. When Bev pushes the Bible in school, Erin sides with Sheriff Hassan in calling that inappropriate and saying that faith is a personal matter. When Riley mentions his naturalistic view of death, she encourages him to express himself fully, listens, and validates him even when his views cause her discomfort. Faith is valuable to her, but she doesn't allow it to undermine her tolerance of others or to place her favored narratives above scrutiny. Upon witnessing Riley's death, she doesn't use her faith to create a comforting narrative to allow her to cope. She mourns and then quickly acts to save others from the impending disaster. Erin escaped the angel's allure and subsequent radicalization, but not because she was more inherently rational or did not share a belief system with those radicalized. Rather, she escaped because she was most concerned with people rather than ideology. In essence, she was a humanist. Her focus on the individuals, Riley, her baby, the Flynns, and ultimately the town itself. Her willingness to sacrifice herself for others at the end was to save people she hadn't even met, those on the mainland. Humanism dealt the killing blow to extremism in the end. In her final scene, we discover that Erin no longer understands death, or anything for that matter, through the lens of Christian faith. Her thoughts become as humanistic as her actions. Erin's deconversion was quite literally a crisis of faith, but in that crisis, she discovers a view that provides her just as much or more utility than her faith ever did. Depictions of deconversion in popular media often focus on joy, comfort, and hope being lost, but Midnight Mass subverts this tired trope in Erin's final monologue. She's not lost or defeated. In shedding the faith of her upbringing, she's finally found what she sought all along, a view which allows her to face the difficult realities of life, hardship, and death with not just grace, but her own joyful song. So, what do we learn from Midnight Mass? What parallels exist between this series and real-world instances of radicalization? First, those who are radicalized are often vulnerable in some way, whether it's financially, socially, or emotionally. Those who are secure in all these ways can be radicalized as well, but it's less common. Next, faith has utility, especially for the vulnerable. Religious practice and community can help people feel a sense of control over their situation and give them hope for the future. Faith is, however, corruptible. It's so malleable that it can be made to fill holes in any narrative, which allows it to serve nearly any purpose. Just as it can justify hope in hopeless situations, it can also justify the pursuit of selfish, delusional goals, personal vendettas, total control of others, and even the taking of innocent lives. Critical thinking skills can serve as an effective defense against some of the harmful permutations of faith, but they can also undermine faith, subtracting from its utility. Some people seem to find a healthy balance there, but it's work, and those who abuse the utility of their own faith for their own gain will always oppose those who find that balance. Finally, it is possible to construct a worldview which integrates critical thinking and has the utility of faith, but lacks any attachment to any religious system or supernatural belief. Again, this is work, but it is doable. As people who have escaped religious radicalization and gone on to construct such worldviews for ourselves, V and I are in a unique position. We're able to identify and empathize with each of the incredibly nuanced characters constructed here, see their pitfalls and blind spots as well as their hopes and fears. Because, in a very real way, vampires aside, we lived it. Thanks for watching. I've been Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. A special thanks to V for collaborating with me on this. Where can people find your work, V?
Thanks for having me on, Drew. It was so much fun. People can find me on my channel, Skeptic Generation. We go live every Sunday at 11:30 a.m. Central. It's a live call-in show, so people like the characters on this show tend to call in and argue with us about their beliefs and, whether or not vampires and angels are real.
And lots of bevs.
Lots of bevs. Too many bevs.
All right, thank you to my patrons for making this video possible. If you want to hear more from me, subscribe and follow me on social media at the handles below. As always, if you are an apostate in need, there are resources linked in the description to help you find community and mental health support. Remember to be kind to others in the comments, and until next time, stay away from communion if it smells funny. Stay skeptical.